Hey guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kawabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. I hope you're all doing well and settling into the new year well. New Year's is one of the most important holidays in the Japanese calendar, and it's a good time to kick back, relax, and try to take a break from things. As such, I hope this week's episode will allow you to do just that as well. This week, we're taking a look at a variety of stories that will make you question your beliefs, stories that will make you wonder about the possibility of the other side and, if it truly exists, what lurks there. Our first story features a technical school teacher who very stubbornly doesn't believe in the supernatural, despite his wife's protests. Is their new house really haunted? Find out in Scientific Soul. This happened when I was attending a technical high school attached to a university. There was a teacher there who taught electronic circuits. He was a good teacher. A little over-enthusiastic, sure, but he was a good guy. We had a kind of love-hate relationship with him. I'll call him Mr. I. So, Mr. I was about to get married, and so he was selling his house. Several of us students helped him with his moving preparations, including myself and a few friends. We helped because we knew that he'd treat us to yakiniku at the end. Yet, when we arrived at his new house on the day of the move, everyone was speechless. It was an old Japanese-style house, 2 stories with a small garden, but no matter how you looked at it, the place looked haunted. Even if you removed the fact that nobody lived there, it still looked haunted. I mean, the windows were covered in charms and everything. Mr. I's wife, a slender, beautiful woman, just about cried when she saw the place. She had apparently left finding the new house up to her husband and hadn't seen it beforehand. I mean, you should probably look at the house you're going to move into before you move into it. But Mr. I was still lively and full of life. "I love old Japanese-style houses like this," he said, like he was implying the rest of us should shut up and agree. He flung the door open triumphantly, and then gestured for the rest of us to follow him. Ugh, how annoying. Inside was even worse than how it looked from the outside, and his wife's face turned pale. I saw it happen before my very eyes. There were stains all over the walls that looked like human faces too. "Let's let some air into this place," Mr. I said, still excited and in high spirits. He tore the charms off the windows in big chunks so he could open it. But not even opening the window could do much to change the darkness in the house. "Let's make this the kids' room in the future," he said, completely unaware of the look on his wife's face. She remained silent. The rest of the moving was carried out smoothly by Mr. I's friends and us students. His wife seemed to perk up a little when she noticed the built-in kitchen, which wasn't exactly modern but clearly different to the rest of the old house. It looked like the kitchen, toilet, and bathroom had all been renovated at some point. The tearful efforts of the real estate. As we ate our yakiniku, his wife muttered to herself, "It's okay. It's okay," over and over. Several of us, including myself, heard it. A week later, Mr. I was chatting during class when he laughed and said that his wife had seen a ghost. He clearly thought the rest of us would laugh as well, but when we looked at the photo he'd brought in, everyone was speechless again. Those of us who had helped him with the move all looked at each other like, "Yep, really is haunted, huh?" Another week later, Mr. I complained during class that his wife had returned to her family home. Again, the rest of us were like, "Yep." To briefly sum up what he said, his wife claimed to have heard footsteps running down the hall at night, seen people standing over her in bed at night, seen a figure in the bathroom mirror as she washed, seen a man looking at her from between the gap in the books on the bookshelf, seen a severed arm crawling towards her in the hallway, noticed a woman pressed up against the window glass, and much more. "But that's impossible," Mr. I said. After that, he went on about how these factual errors and illusions are just caused by the functions of the brain. Yet, another week after that, Mr. I told us that his wife was planning to divorce him unless he agreed to move, despite how much he loved that house. Everyone was speechless once again. He loved that house and he didn't want to move, so he planned to prove to his wife that there were no ghosts. He said he needed some helpers, but of course nobody wanted to go back to that house again, so nobody raised their hands. But then one of my friends, unable to stand it any longer, raised his hand, so reluctantly, I did too. Friendship is important, right? So then, on the day, one of Mr. I's friends who helped him move was there as well. "So, you kids like this sort of thing too, huh?" he said when he saw us. "Of course not," we said. "So you scientific souls aren't scared of this sort of thing, huh?" Pfft, of course we were scared. Mr. I addressed us simply. If this house is cursed, then there should be proof of that curse. But something was wrong. He ignored his wife, on the verge of tears, and declared, "Today we're going to find whatever that is, and destroy it." And so, we began our search. Some of the things we found included a large number of articulated doll arms, right arms only, several headless Buddhist statues, some round thing covered in charms, several pictures that couldn't have been drawn by anybody sane, a small wooden box covered in charms and tightly wound with string, a jar full of what looked like mice bones, and a strangely stained hanging scroll. There were other things as well, but we found these in the roof, under the floorboards, and in unused rooms. Mr. I groaned as we laid them all out in the garden. "And they really sold me this place full of junk like there was nothing wrong with it at all?" He was clearly angry about the wrong thing here. But he finally seemed to be coming around and realized there was possibly some history to the house if all of this stuff was here. But that presented him with the next problem. How am I supposed to get rid of all this? Ah, so that was the problem. His friend gave him a suggestion. "I'll ask one of the professors I know if he wants any of it. If he doesn't, then the university will get rid of it for you." His friend called another friend of his who came around with a car to pick everything up. They took almost everything. The only things left in the garden were the jar full of bones and the pictures. Mr. I suddenly lit the pictures on fire. His wife looked at us with tears in her eyes. It wasn't like there was anything we could do. "And what should we do with this?" Mr. I said, holding the jar. Then he dropped it and broke it. His wife's face twitched and then stiffened. I looked at his friend and his face twitched too. "Oops," Mr. I said, grabbing a dustpan and broom and sweeping the pieces of jar and bones up. When he was done, he suddenly returned to the house and then placed the bones and jar fragments into an empty cookie tin. "Should be able to throw this out with the non-burnable trash, right?" he said to his friend. "All right then, all done." I don't know what was so all right about the situation, but apparently it was over. On the train back home, my friend confessed something to me. I just saw a ghost for the first time in my life. The moment he broke that jar, the yard filled with these black hazy figures, and then they all walked off somewhere. he said. The next day, Mr. I declared happily to us, "My wife is no longer talking about going back to her family home." Small villages often come with their own traditions, their own stories, and their own monsters. The young boy in this next story goes to stay with his great aunt, but soon finds there a particular rule that he must follow when in her house. He must first knock on the door, and if a knock returns, he must stay inside. He can't go out until the knocking stops. But who's out there knocking, and why can't he go out? Find out why in Senju-san. I'm getting married next year, so I'm going to take this opportunity to get a few things out in the open. This happened when I was in elementary school. My mother was ill with some type of difficult sickness at the time, and she was hospitalized in a hospital far away. Our house was often empty as my father went to visit her, and so they didn't pay too much attention to me. Some people from the neighborhood and relatives worked together to take care of me, but still, they must have shouldered a lot to do so. About a month into the summer holidays, I was sent to stay with my great aunt on my father's side. She lived in the mountains between two cities, and well, she had electricity, but the nearest neighbors were a 10-minute walk away, and the river water was so clean that you could drink it straight from the source. It was full of fish, too. My great aunt was the eldest daughter of the head family, so I guess you could say her parents interfered in her life a lot. She was single and already looking after her sick parents. She lived in an old but sturdy Japanese-style house with vegetables in the garden, and she even rented out some of the land to people, so she lived a comfortable life. Apparently, she could sell the land for a high price once they built the road through the mountains, so that alone made her enough money to live well. My father loved the ocean, mountains, and nature in general, so I'd actually been to my great aunt's house several times before. My mother had been gone for so long that I was used to being lonely by that point. But my great aunt's house reminded me of Tonari no Totoro, one of my favorite movies that I'd watched over and over again, like most kids do with things they love. My dad brought me a lot of comics before we went so I wouldn't be bored, which made me really happy. We left in the morning by car, and we arrived at her house just after lunchtime. We rang the doorbell, and although there were signs of movement inside the house, for some reason she didn't answer the door right away. Before long, the old metal bar lock rattled, and then finally the front door opened. Seemed she was in the middle of getting ready, and when we went inside, she'd prepared all sorts of snacks and told me that I could freely use the tatami room. I didn't even have a room of my own at home, so I was super happy. My father said his goodbyes, and then about 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of knocking on wood coming from behind the house. "Ah, Senju-san's here," my great aunt said. I figured it was someone from the neighborhood. The comic Butsu-zone was popular at the time, and the main character in that was also called Senju-kun, so I laughed when I remembered. "I have something very important to tell you, so please come here," my great aunt said to me, and then she took me to the back of the house. There was some uncovered dirt beneath what looked like a stone stair entrance, and in front of that was a wooden wall. It had a handle, so at first I thought it was the back door, but it just looked like one and didn't actually open. The knocking continued at regular intervals for a bit, before finally stopping. My great aunt knocked in much the same fashion from the inside of the door, and soon the knock was returned. She turned to me and said that if there was a response, then I must stay inside, and she repeated this several times until I understood. I wasn't aware of scary stories or anything at that age, so I innocently accepted her explanation. This went on for a bit until finally there was no knock in response. "Let's go out and get some vegetables for dinner," my great aunt said, finally taking me outside. We picked some tomatoes and eggplant and then returned to the house. While I was there, I caught bugs, fished, read comics and watched TV, although I could only do that for 2 hours max. I spoke to my dad on the phone and I helped my great aunt around the house as well. There were no shops nearby, nor any other kids to play with, so it was a little boring, but I was used to being alone. So I drew a picture diary when I had nothing else to do. I studied and I finished all my summer homework rather quickly. About 3 weeks passed uneventfully in this manner. I was bored of the comics I had, so when one of the neighbours said that they had some leftover comics from their own children that I could borrow, I went to go to their house. Normally, it took less than 30 minutes for the knocks on the wood to stop, but on this day, the knocks kept coming. Annoyed, I ignored it and went to the front door. My great aunt was in the living room, saying something or other in her local dialect, but I ignored her, put my shoes on, and opened the door. When the door was about 20 or 30 centimeters open, a hand suddenly shot through the gap and gripped my right wrist. The hand had 5 fingers, but it was covered in light brown hair, like an animal. It had long, sharp claws that very clearly weren't human, and instantly I broke out into a cold sweat. It tried to yank me outside, and as I screamed, my great aunt came running in and slammed the door shut. Senju-san's arm got caught in the door and it screeched like a cat does when someone stands on its tail, and then pulled its arm back outside. My great aunt then quickly locked the door. The door shook and the creature tried to get back in, but my great aunt braced herself against the door. All I could do was watch in astonishment. The door was made of frosted glass, so I could see something on the other side, but I couldn't clearly see what it was. That made it all the more creepier. I don't know how much time passed, but it seemed to give up on the door, and then the rattling stopped. Then the banging on the wood out the back started. The house was surrounded by gravel, and yet I didn't hear a single footstep. Senju-san had moved around to the back of the house without making a sound. That seemed to be the end of it, but my great aunt got angry at me for not listening to her warnings. "Things could have been so much worse if it hadn't been you," she said. I was already pretty darn scared, and I still had a mark on my arm where the creature had grabbed me, so I burst into tears and I wanted to go home right away. My great aunt called my father, and although it was an emergency, he said he would be around the next morning to pick me up, which calmed me down. My great aunt and I hurried to pack my things. That night I slept in my great aunt's room, but I could still hear that sound outside, so I was too scared to get any sleep. I watched my great aunt go knock on the back door when I heard my father's car arrive, but there was no response, so I immediately ran outside. She had looked after me, but after that, I never went near her house again. When my great aunt died and all our relatives gathered for her funeral, I didn't think it would be the right time to ask about Senju-san, but I also couldn't help myself. Because my great aunt was unmarried, there weren't many people who knew much about it, but apparently the name Senju-san was written with the kanji for original inhabitant, and because our family came to the mountains from somewhere else, they had long stood out in the neighbourhood. I also realised that the firstborn children of our family all shared something in common with their names, although I won't say what that is here. Of course, that meant my great aunt too. When she said that something worse would have happened if it hadn't have been me, and her being a woman and yet still inheriting the house and land, I realised that it was probably all related. After the recent earthquake, The family's house was demolished and the land disposed of. And although none of us live on the mountain anymore, and I don't think we'll ever set foot there again, I have been wondering what I should call my child when it's born. Even now, I'm still not very good at answering knocks on the door. Japan isn't the only country with traditions that must be upheld and local spirits who must be appeased. The woman in this next story is about to get married to a Thai man, and they head back to his hometown to let his family know. But while there, they're told that they must abide by the village's long-standing traditions. Otherwise... Find out why in Village Legend. This happened 17 years ago. My husband is Thai, and at the time, we'd been living together for about 2 years, looking to eventually get married. His family home was a farming village, roughly 2 hours from the city, and seeing as we were about to tie the knot, we decided to head back to visit his parents. Road congestion meant that we didn't arrive there until that evening, and after a brief introduction to his parents, we went to visit his grandparents and other relatives in the same village, before returning for a break. I cracked a beer and started drinking. Then my future husband's grandfather appeared and started yelling at him about something. I could speak a little Thai at the time, but they used a dialect, so I couldn't understand a thing. I just watched his grandfather as he screamed, not understanding anything he said. "What's wrong?" I asked my husband when he returned. He said I need to obey the village's tradition. According to my husband, it was forbidden for married couples to shower together. It angered the local kami-sama. Something like that. As the night wore on, we lay out our bed, hung the mosquito net, and I grabbed a bottle of water just in case I got thirsty and placed it by my pillow. Life in the village meant going to bed early and waking early, so my future husband's parents had already gone to bed 3 hours earlier. We were sleeping in the room right next to the entrance, so we closed the door, turned the lights off, and got into bed. There are a few street lights in the Thai countryside, and once the sun set, it was pitch black. Most houses had a few middle-sized dogs as guard dogs, and because dogs grow even more wary at night, few people walked around after dark, meaning lights weren't necessary. When my husband turned the light off above us, the room instantly went dark. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but because there was no light coming in from outside, it didn't change much. I was a little frightened, but I was also tired from the trip, so I soon fell asleep. I woke up during the night feeling thirsty, so I groped around for my water bottle. My husband also woke up and he helped me look for it. The dogs outside seemed to be upset about something, and they all started howling and running around like crazy. They certainly were energetic. At that moment, a light briefly flashed across my hand, and thanks to it, I was able to find the water bottle. I took a drink, but then I noticed something strange. Huh? Eh? Something fluorescent and about the size of a ping pong ball floated around the room. A firefly? No, they got in through the mosquito net. There were countless small lights just like it floating throughout the room, but then a short while later, they all stopped. They floated silently in the air. I suddenly grew scared and grabbed my husband. "Can you see them?" he asked. "Yeah," I answered. "Don't look, close your eyes," he said strongly, but I peeked and saw it. A tiny girl stood above me, looking down at my face. I was so scared that I wanted to scream, but I managed to hold it in. The figure certainly looked like a girl, but I didn't sense any life coming from her. She was just like a doll. I looked around the room, trying to distract myself from the fear I felt, and I realized that we were surrounded by figures that looked human and they were all moving around us. "Dad!" my husband screamed. We heard a response from the second floor, and then my husband stood up to turn the light on. "It's not working. Neither of the lights are working." His father came running down from the second floor, hearing his son's panicked voice, and the lights turned on in an instant, freeing us. The next morning, his grandfather arrived to question us. "What happened? What did you see?" Apparently the same thing had happened on the second floor, at his grandparents' house, and even at his dead grandmother's sister's house, all at the same time. Apparently there was more to the village tradition that my husband-to-be hadn't told me. It was also forbidden for unmarried couples to sleep in the same room when they had informed their relatives of their upcoming nuptials. My husband-to-be figured that it was just a legend, so he didn't pay much attention to it. But now that something strange had happened, he felt bad about it. His ancestors were always watching over him, yet he'd offended them with his rude actions. What were we supposed to do? "Let's have the marriage ceremony right now," his grandfather said. And so, preparations began. Thanks to his grandfather's quick thinking, we held a special marriage ceremony and promptly informed his ancestors at the same time. After that, we took the village tradition seriously, and nothing strange ever happened again. There were various customs and traditions in my husband's hometown, and neither of us being deeply religious, we listened to them absent-mindedly. "You must obey these traditions. You understand?" Even now, I still clearly remember his grandfather's warning. And it was this event that made me realize that sometimes disasters can be caused by certain traditions and customs. The woman in this next story receives a phone call one day, letting her know that an old friend has passed away. But as she reminisces and finds out more about what happened, the terrifying truth is revealed. Find out what in A-san's Friend. One day, I received word that one of my close friends from high school had died. It was a woman's voice I didn't know. I asked her how she got my phone number, and she said, "I got it from her. You were her only friend." The woman who called said that she had known her since childhood and still lived nearby. But to say that I was her only friend, I'll call her A-san, there was no way that was true. We were in the same club at high school, and A-san was popular with everyone. She was beautiful, and all eyes were always on her. She was kind and bright as well. Even all the boys liked her when they whispered about the other girls. A-san often came to talk to me about her problems. This person was gross. She turned down this person for a date, etc., etc. For someone like me, they were pretty luxurious problems to have. A-san was always so concerned with others around her that, in contrast to how she appeared, she told me she was always nervous and high-strung. The one memory that stuck out most was a story she told me about the senpai I liked. I almost wanted to cover my ears as she came to me, crying, saying that he had attacked her. There was no way. He was an earnest student, strong-willed and smart. No matter how desirable A was, there was no way he would use violence against her. I decided to ignore her and paid no attention to what she said. In the end, I graduated high school without revealing my feelings towards him. I figured he would be better off with a good-looking girl like her, not a plain girl like me. When I saw A-san at our 10-year reunion, she was surrounded by people fussing over her, as always. She said that she was still single and had no plans to marry, but I couldn't believe that. As I watched her in her cute dress, smiling and being pleasant with everyone, I hated her. We hadn't seen each other in a long while, but I put some distance between us and tried to avoid her. I want to die. That night, I got a message from A-san. Honestly, I didn't want to deal with her, but I messaged her for close to an hour, trying to cheer her up and put an end to things. I hadn't once gone out with A-san since high school, and at best we messaged each other only once or twice a year. I had a few close friends, but with how popular A-san was, I figured she had to have had a whole lot more than me. I didn't think we were friends at all. Several days passed, and then I got that earlier message. She was serious about wanting to die? I was confused at this phone call from the person calling herself a childhood friend. I'm a terrible person and I don't like anyone. Everyone is always approaching me and it's exhausting. It's always the same. Not only will I never fall in love with them, it's gross how kindly they treat me. Isn't there someone who would just meet with me when I have things to do? For sure, A-san had said something like that to me before she died. Shortly thereafter, I went to visit her grave. It wasn't like we were total strangers, and I figured I could at least say my final goodbye to her. But there was still something that bothered me. 3 days before I went to visit her grave, I got a call from my mum. Apparently, she'd run into A-san's father while out and he'd spoken to her. He wanted to thank you for always being so kind to his daughter. And he said that she wanted to see you one more time on her final night. But the strange thing is that while my mum knew A-san's name, she'd never met her father before, and they certainly didn't have any type of relationship that would cause them to stop each other on the road to speak. He said he wanted you to know because he'd heard that you were such good friends. Even my mother seemed suspicious of that. I contacted A-san's parents and asked them where she was buried. When I was almost there, my heart suddenly started beating faster, and I broke out in a sweat. No exaggerating, I couldn't breathe either. I sat down on the side of the road and looked up at the sky, muttering, "You don't want to see me? Fine, I'll leave. I'm not kidding." Before long, my breathing calmed down. I returned down the path I'd come, and the further I got away, the better I felt. For A-san, I was just someone there at the right time. Someone there when she wanted to see me and nothing else. That was all I was to her. That night, my mum apparently got a phone call from A-san's father, thanking me for visiting his daughter's grave. "Please tell her that my daughter was very pleased," he said. Something didn't feel right. I had to get away from A-san. I wanted to tell him that we weren't close friends, and he'd made a wrong one-sided assumption. But his daughter was dead, so I couldn't say a thing. I debated what to do, but in the end, I sent A-san another message. "Don't contact me. If I need you, I'll let you know. Even if you call me, I won't come." I actually got a reply. "Sorry for the trouble." I later learnt that all of the men around me had confessed to A-san at least once. Even at gatherings of just us girls, A-san would always come up when we got to talking of the past. Everybody loved her, and it seemed that not only was I the only one who couldn't care less, I was the only one who didn't like her at all. So, for that reason alone, I probably was special to Ei-san. It's not uncommon for pregnant women in Japan to return to their family home as they near birth, so that more experienced family members can help them through the difficult early stages. Yet, when this woman returns to her family home, she starts hearing what sounds like footsteps running around the house at night. Who or what could it be? Find out in Child's Footsteps. This is a strange experience that really happened at my family home. I returned to my parents' house to give birth to my child, and from the latter stages of my pregnancy until after I gave birth, I stayed with them. My parents' home was a 2-story detached house, and because both my older sister and I had already moved out, they lived there alone. My parents' bedroom was on the first floor, so I used one of the empty rooms on the second floor. This happened while I was lying on the futon on the floor, like always. My stomach was pretty big by that point, so I struggled to sleep and was never able to stay asleep for very long. My entire body hurt, so I often woke up during the night. But still, I closed my eyes and tried to get back to sleep again. Dun dun dun. I suddenly heard the sound of someone running nearby. I listened closer and the sound seemed to be coming from above me. At first I figured I was just sleepy, so I didn't pay much attention to the noise. But after that, I kept hearing that same sound night after night. There it is again. It was a 2-story house, and my room was on the second floor, meaning there was no way anyone should have been able to run around above me. Maybe the noise sounded like it was coming from above me, when in reality it was just the sound of my parents' footsteps echoing from the first floor instead. Or maybe it was a mouse or a cat running around up there. I thought up various solutions to dampen the fear I felt and tried not to focus on the sound too much. But even so, I could still hear it. One night, my parents had to go out to deal with a few things. I didn't really want to be there alone, but I was heavily pregnant, so I remained in the house. Then, I heard those footsteps again. Those footsteps that sounded like a small child running around barefoot. Up until that point, I'd always heard the footsteps when someone else was also in the house. But this time, I was alone. I shouldn't have been able to hear anyone else's footsteps. Now that I could no longer pretend that it wasn't real, I figured I should talk to my parents about it. But before I could do that, I suddenly went into labor. It was an easy delivery, but my health took a turn for the worse after that, and nursing the baby was much harder than I expected. I was exhausted every single day. I was no longer in any condition to care about the footsteps, and I soon forgot about them. Several years later, we got to talking about having a get-together, and the whole family gathered at my parents' place for Obon, including my older sister's family as well. We enjoyed our mother's home-cooked food, and as I went to wash the dishes after our meal, I overheard my mother and sister talking. "You know, sometimes I hear footsteps in this house." I suddenly remembered what happened when I stayed there last and threw myself into their conversation. "I've heard the same thing too." Apparently, my mother started hearing the footsteps for the first time about 3 years before I returned for my pregnancy. She could hear it as she sat in the living room during the day. It sounded just like a child running around barefoot. But the house across the road had a small child, around 3 or 4 years old, so she brushed it off and assumed it was that child she was hearing instead. Right around the time she was about to forget about the footsteps, she heard them again, so she started to wonder if maybe it was a zashiki warashi instead. People tend to associate those with good luck, so the footsteps suddenly seemed less scary. She had no proof it was that, but she decided it had to be, and figured they could coexist in the same house. Oddly, our father had never once heard the footsteps, so she'd kept quiet about it, but now it was all out in the open. The night wore on, and it was time to take a bath. My sister had spent the whole time looking for something. Apparently her kids' pajama bottoms had gone missing. Apparently she had taken them out of their travel bag and laid them out in the living room so they could get changed after their bath. They had just been there, and now they were gone, so everyone helped her to look for them. But in the end, the pajama bottoms were nowhere to be seen. I'm sure I left them right there. My sister was confused, but her child got changed into some different clothes, and that was that. The next morning I woke up a little late, and the first thing my sister said to me was, "Hey, did you leave these here?" Apparently she'd found the pajama bottoms. They were in the Japanese-style room across from the living room. Our grandfather's altar was in that room, and the pants had apparently been discarded in front of it. My sister had gone around asking everyone if they had put them there, but nobody had touched them. They were lying in an open place, so somebody would have found them the night before when we were all looking. The pants were deep pink, so even mixed in with other clothes, they still stood out. Maybe the owner of the footsteps hid them, we joked. But it was a strange event that didn't really seem like a joke. As I was talking to my mother again at a later date, I asked her once again about the footsteps. "I still hear them," she said. Whatever settled into that house with my parents, seems it's still there with them. Once again, a big shout out and thank you to this week's Kami tier member on YouTube, Jojo. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this. So thank you very much. You rock. If you'd like to chat about this week's stories, don't forget to join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror that you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.